probably the best natural alternative, or whatever you want to call it, extended cancer therapy ever is mistletoe therapy, sometimes known as Iscador or Elixir, or one of the brands of mistletoe. And I wrote the case in my book of a woman who's a friend of mine, young woman, stage 4, colon cancer spread to her liver. She had a couple young children, decided not to do chemo, basically just did mistletoe therapy. 10 years later, she's disease-free. Now, that doesn't happen with everybody, but it certainly happens sometimes. And the literature is very clear that people who do mistletoe therapy have better prognosis than people who don't.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Holistic Hilda here. This is episode 227, and our guest is Dr. Tom Cowan. Dr. Cowan has a holistic family medicine practice in San Francisco, California. He is the author of numerous thought-provoking books, and his latest is Cancer and the New Biology of Water. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on cancer. Listen to part 1, which is episode 226, for the background on how cancer grows in the body and why our war on cancer for the past 50 years has been markedly unsuccessful. In today's episode, part 2, Dr. Cowan digs even deeper into our understanding of the problem of cancer. He talks about what it does in our bodies and what we do to eradicate it or avoid it altogether. He discusses what therapies are recommended in lieu of the standard surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. He covers the pros and cons of Gerson therapy, the ketogenic diet, and mistletoe. And he explains what long-term strategies we should adopt to avoid cancer altogether and cultivate vibrant health. Before we get into it, I want to remind you that there's a quick and easy way to learn the basics of the Wise Traditions lifestyle. It is a free 7 easy lessons that you can get by just clicking on the link in the show notes. It's not complicated to live ancestrally and to enjoy food as nature intended. So check it out. And a quick shout out to our sponsor, Ancestral Supplements. This episode is brought to you in part by grass-fed liver and bone marrow by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, liver, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. I take liver every day, and our family loves these supplements. Check them out at ancestralsupplements.com. They put back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome back, Tom. Welcome to Wise Traditions.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
On this episode, we want to talk about the therapies that you highlight in your book for a new way to approach cancer.
Okay.
So, in other words, we talked last time about the standard protocol of surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. Surgery and radiation being those that kind of get rid of the tumor that's currently in the body, and chemotherapy promising the hope that they might be able to eradicate any future cancerous cell growth, right?
Right.
So what therapies do you recommend in lieu of this? Can we just go through some of those that you mentioned in your book?
One of the ways I approached this was, because I also have a long history of observing or, helping people do all different kinds of therapies. So the thesis of this is, number one, the problem of cancer lies in the cytoplasm. And then more specifically, the problem in the cytoplasm is that for some reason, the water has not formed itself into proper crystalline gels, and that's interfering with basically everything about how a cell works. I also, interestingly enough, have come upon research that says that the water in the nucleus, the crystalline water in the nucleus, determines the expression of the DNA. So even these so-called somatic mutations, the abnormal expression of the DNA, that itself has something to do with abnormality of the water. So then I looked at all these different therapies, like the ketogenic diet and the Gerson therapy and mistletoe therapy and chaga mushrooms and deuterium-depleted water, from the perspective of how does it affect this cytoplasmic crystalline water. And so here's what you find. First of all, Gerson, which is one of the most famous alternative therapies, and I had an experience of, a friend of mine who cured himself temporarily anyways with stage 4 testicular cancer. He did the Gerson therapy. It went away. He lived another 10 years. It came back, and then he didn't want to do it again. But it was very dramatic. And a lot of people, not everybody, have been cured. So if you go back and say, so what did Gerson say about this? He said, the problem is the distribution of sodium potassium across the cell membrane is disturbed. The potassium has leaked out of the cell. There's no more charge. And so I'm going to give you a very high potassium, low sodium diet, and that's going to fix it. That's exactly what I'm saying. The only trouble is he didn't understand the full implications of how this sodium potassium balance came about. He didn't have any idea really, but he knew there was something to do with that. And even he, helped invent a juicer called the Norwalk juicer, which he said, if you don't use a Norwalk juicer, this will never work. And the whole principle of the Norwalk juicer is to essentially extract the cytoplasm out of a carrot as undisturbed as possible. So in other words, he was looking for this water matrix in the cytoplasm. And he said, if you did it in a juicer that doesn't do it like this, it won't work.
So even though he didn't have a full grasp of the whole theory behind this crystalline water gel, like he still got part of it right. And so
he got part of it right.
Can you explain the Gerson therapy for those who are unfamiliar with it? I know it has to do with a lot of vegetables and fruits, right?
It's basically a vegan diet with a lot of carrot juice and coffee enemas, and every 2 hours they drank fresh liver juice, which is why it's actually not a vegan diet. He basically chose foods based on their potassium and sodium content. So the vegetables have low sodium and high potassium, except celery, which has high sodium, and that's why he told people not to eat celery. It's as simple as that. And he used the coffee enemas to detoxify, which, as I've explained in my other book, when you have poisons dissolved in your gel, then it interferes with the function of the gel. So if you detoxify with whatever, like coffee enemas, that actually helps you form better gels. So he got some of this right, but my point was that because he didn't really know what he was dealing with, he didn't understand where this whole thing comes about, the therapy was sort of doomed to not be the final answer. And here's another one. So, one of probably the best natural alternative, or whatever you want to call it, extended cancer therapy ever is mistletoe therapy, sometimes known as Iscador or Elixir, or one of the brands of mistletoe. And I wrote the case in my book of a woman who's a friend of mine, young woman, stage 4, colon cancer spread to her liver. She had a couple young children, decided not to do chemo, basically just did mistletoe therapy. 10 years later, she's disease-free. Now, that doesn't happen with everybody, but it certainly happens sometimes. And the literature is very clear that people who do mistletoe therapy have better prognosis than people who don't. So again, what does mistletoe therapy do? Well, if you ask Rudolf Steiner, who came up with it, he said, mistletoe therapy is a therapy for your etheric body. And what is an etheric body? An etheric body is the water body. So in other words, Steiner himself said, there's something wrong with your water body. There's something wrong with the way that the water forms itself in this person. And that creates the cancer. So here's mistletoe. It will straighten out your water body and it will help you with cancer. He also said something interesting, which is if you treat the cancer before there's a tumor, when it's still in the, quote, etheric or water body, it will always cure the person of cancer, which is great, except nobody knows when you have a cancer in your etheric body.
Right. So I wonder if people should do some of this mistletoe or even the Gerson therapy proactively before they know of any diagnosis.
I mean, that certainly is an option, and some people have said that. So that's another one that you can understand from this therapy. And then you get into something like deuterium-depleted water, which, what's so interesting about this, and I wrote about this in my book. So here you have a study published in, a standard peer-reviewed oncology journal where they take identical people with prostate cancer, and one of them they give, standard care, and the other they give standard care, and the only thing different is they have them drink deuterium-depleted water. And the outcome is basically the people live twice as long at any stage of prostate cancer. And then they did it for breast cancer, and they basically live 2 to 3 times as long. So that's a unbelievably dramatic therapy. So one person I know was very interested in doing some research on what I was saying. So he has me have an appointment with a fairly well-known oncology researcher in the Bay Area. So I meet with them, I give him these studies, we're talking about whether he wants to investigate deuterium-depleted water. And he says, so how does this work? And so I explained a little bit of my theory, and he says, yeah, but we know that it's the oncogenes that cause this. So there's no way, there's no mechanism that shows how deuterium depletion affects oncogenes, which as far as I know, there isn't. So I'm not interested in this therapy. In other words, he and the whole establishment is so wedded into their theory that even when they have a result that they can't explain, I said, well, how do you explain the result? He says, I can't. And that's the end of it. There's no more curiosity. There's no more, well, maybe we're wrong here or anything like that. It doesn't fit our theory, so I'm not interested. And that's where we're at.
Wow. That's discouraging, but you are still getting the word out about these alternative therapies for those who have open minds.
Well, you could say open minds. I mean, what's so interesting about this, I just heard about another oncologist from England who has written, I think, a kind of a best-selling book about basically cancer therapy, chemotherapy has failed. And you have people who are in the end of cancer, they go to the oncologist says, yeah, this probably won't work very well, but this is all we got. And so they do it. And it makes their life miserable. The chemotherapy, like they say, they'd rather be dead than do this stuff. But they do it anyways. And you think, why do they do that? Why do they not look into something different? And one of the answers came, a friend of mine was talking to her friend whose husband was a medical doctor. He has, end-stage cancer. They tell him there's nothing they can do about it. And she says to him, why don't you investigate alternatives? Why don't you do something different? The answer was because it would ruin his worldview. He's basically spent his whole life believing in a certain way of thinking, and that's all he has. That's all we have these days. Unfortunately, it's wrong.
Yeah, and would you rather have your worldview ruined and keep living, or?
Yes, and that's the choice. Most people would rather hang on to their worldview than even then live. So fine. I mean, that's their choice, I guess.
Coming up, Tom discusses why the keto diet is a recommended therapy for fighting cancer, and he also offers us some long-term strategies to maintain our health.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Hey, we have a simple way to learn more about the Wise Traditions lifestyle so you can have it at your fingertips. We make available online 7 easy lessons for free on our website. We kind of encapsulate the principles so you can understand what they're about and have the basics handy. So sign up for them using the link in the show notes. The 7 easy lessons are for you to enjoy. They are our free gift to you. And this episode is brought to you in part by grass-fed liver and bone marrow by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced, nose-to-tail organ meats, liver, and bone marrow in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Beef liver and bone marrow are the most effective foods to support health and wellness. These traditional foods were, and still are, fundamental to our biology. It's incredibly insightful to see animals in the wild instinctively go for the liver and the bone marrow first, leaving the muscle meat for the birds. Even then, birds will be caught taking marrow bones high into the sky and dropping them onto the rocks in order to gain access to the inside. Liver and bone marrow provide concentrated amounts of vitamin A, choline, folate, B12, copper, heme iron, and fat-soluble activators that are now absent from the modern diet. This nourishment is known to support methylation and fundamental health, so visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Well, let's talk a little bit about the keto diet. I noticed you mentioned that in your book as well.
So that gets into some interesting stuff because, when I get into, so how does this crystalline gel form? And it's very similar to the way that Jell-O is formed. In order to make Jell-O, you take water. Jell-O is about 97% water. You take gelatin proteins, and then if you add just water and gelatin proteins, nothing happens. So then you have to heat the mixture, and what happens is it unfolds the proteins so that they're able to interact with water. Then they interact with water, and then you cool it, and it forms Jell-O. So that's how gels are formed, in our kitchen. In our cells, it's very similar. We have the intracellular matrix, the cytoplasmic matrix. They're mostly proteins like actin. And then we have water. So the question is, what plays the role of heat? Because we have to unfold these proteins so that they can interact with water. And you can't put a Bunsen burner in your pancreas. So it turns out that, again, Gilbert Ling proved, and this is, I think, shocking for most people to hear, that ATP, this so-called energy molecule, has nothing to do with energy. And you have no idea, or maybe you do, how heretical that is. But what he said was that the ATP attaches to the ends of these cytoplasmic proteins and unfolds them so that they can interact with water and make the gels. So to be clear, I didn't say that ATP isn't important. Mm-hmm. And indirectly, ATP does create the energy, because if you have an ATP deficiency, then you can't unfold the proteins and you can't interact with water, you can't form gels, you can't distribute your sodium, potassium, you can't form a charge, and you've got a dysfunctional or dead cell. So ATP is crucial here, but not as a source of energy. It's a source of creation of the gels. Now, you get to the ketogenic diet. The standard explanation of the ketogenic diet is, well, we know about this Warburg effect, that all cancer cells have shifted their metabolism so that they no longer respire normally, which is how we generate ATP in the mitochondria. And something has happened, and they shift to a fermentation or glycolysis, glycolytic pathways, which are much less efficient in making ATP. So normal respiration, or oxidative phosphorylation, makes 36 ATP for every glucose, whereas glycolysis makes 2.
Oh, wow.
So when you switch from normal respiration to fermentation, the so-called Warburg effect, the cells need 18 times as much glucose in order to survive, which is the whole basis of PET scans. Oncologists find cancer because cancer cells, because they rely on glycolysis, have to upregulate their intake of glucose to 18 times normal if they can, which allows us to find it on a PET scan. All we do is radioactively tag glucose. We see where it goes. The ones that take it up most, that's the cancer cell, and that's how oncologists find cancer. So the theory is that the cancer cells need a lot of glucose. So if you starve them by giving the person no sugar at all, no carbohydrates, that's the ketogenic diet, that will starve the cancer and feed the normal cells, and your cancer will go away. That's the theory. The problem with that theory, as anybody who's actually done it, and I have with patients, is according to Seyfried, Thomas Seyfried, who's really the dean of this theory, and he's done some brilliant work on this. I give him lots of credit. But he says, in order to effectively starve the cancer, the blood sugar has to go down to in the 50s or low 60s. The trouble is, no matter how few carbohydrates you eat, even if you eat zero, even if you don't eat anything, even if you just water fast, typically the blood sugar level won't drop below about 80 because the body doesn't want a blood sugar lower than 80, and it will use any mechanism it can, burning your fat, burning your protein, burning your organs, etc., to keep the blood sugar stable. So this idea that ketogenic diet works by lowering the blood sugar cannot be correct. It's just not possible. I'm not saying it's not good for diabetics, because it is, and I'm not saying it's not helpful, because it is, but the mechanism cannot possibly be lowering the blood sugar. So what is the mechanism? Well, it turns out that most of the water, or at least a large percentage of the water in our cells, is water we generate ourselves from the metabolism of food. And one of the factors that determines the health of our gels is how much deuterium, which is an isotope of hydrogen, makes up our water. The higher the deuterium level, the more, quote, goofy your gels are. And it turns out that fats, because of their complex structure, cannot incorporate deuterium into their molecules, whereas glucose can. So when you switch from a glucose-based fuel to a fat-based fuel, exactly like, Nourishing Tradition says, you end up lowering the deuterium levels in your cells, which then helps you form gels properly and increases the efficiency of your mitochondria that make the ATP in the first place. And it actually heals the defect. So the effect of a ketogenic diet is exactly what I would have predicted. It's through the levels of deuterium which affect the structure of the water in the cells.
So in other words, the ketogenic diet is helpful, but maybe not for the reason we think.
Right. And there are research papers that absolutely prove this, that the effect of ketogenic diet, yes, it's helpful, but not because it lowers the blood sugar, because it doesn't. It changes the level of deuterium, which then allows you to form better gels and allows you to create energy in a more efficient way, because the deuterium interferes with these little motors in the mitochondrial membranes. And that's how it works. In other words, the whole sort of world of why things work, my plan was that it starts to make sense now.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think you are very good at going into the details and helping us get a grasp on not only that it works, but how it works, and if it is a good idea to pursue a certain therapy. And that's what I wanted to ask you next, actually, Tom, are some of these therapies that you highlighted in your book, are they intended for just short-term use or longer term? What's your stance on that?
Every person with cancer or who doesn't want to get cancer or thinks about cancer is different, right? It's one of the hallmarks of the way I think about medicine is essentially we're each a unique story. And even to think about cancer treated generically, even that is a mistake. Like one person's cancer comes from glyphosate exposure, maybe another is poor diet, another is they never get out in the sun and sit in front of Wi-Fi all day. And so all those are different situations. So it's hard to answer that generically, except if you said, is getting out in the sun and connecting with the earth and having loving relations with your family and friends and your dog, Is that a long-term strategy or a short-term one? I would say that's a lifelong strategy. You should do all those for the rest of your life. If you said, should you sleep in a room with has your Wi-Fi router on? I would say no, and that's a long-term strategy. I don't know when that's going to become a good thing for you. My guess is never.
Exactly.
And then if you get into something like deuterium-depleted water, that, you have to be more careful because you want to deplete your deuterium levels to around 135 and keep them there. So that takes a little bit more, expertise and investigation to find out what the best strategy for that is.
Got it. So did you mention the biology of water in the title of your book? Because this is really central to our understanding how cancer functions and how we should go after it.
My basic reason for that is we have a theory in medicine and biology, and I would dare say in our entire society, that basically says, let me just talk about medicine for a minute, that the only thing that exists is stuff, like physical matter. Now, even though if you actually look at physical matter, according to the physicists, and you have a nucleus and then you have an electron somewhere across the street, and most of it is just space, nothing. So how does this stuff that's made out of 99.9% space actually form a leg? I mean, nobody knows. And then they tell us that sometimes the stuff is actually like a particle, and sometimes it isn't even a particle, it's a wave which has no substance at all. And then they tell us that the thing that determines whether it's a particle or a wave is whether you look at it or not, or your consciousness, which is totally bizarre. So in other words, I'm a wave walking around unless I think I'm a particle, and then I'm a particle which is made out of nothing. The analogy that I like to make is we have a medical system that wants to understand the Mona Lisa, right? The most famous painting of all time. But the rules of engagement are you're only allowed to study the paint and the canvas. You're not allowed to ask, hey, I wonder why this guy painted this. You're not allowed to investigate anything that has to do with actually why he painted this. Now, I'm not saying he didn't use paint or he didn't use canvas. And it turns out Da Vinci was actually interested in the quality of his paints, which I don't blame him, because they have a certain relevance. But everything that's important about the Mona Lisa, it was in the mind and heart of Da Vinci. That's clear. But yet we are not allowed to study that because we don't acknowledge that it exists. The biology of water says the difference between stuff and life has to work through water. In other words, you take stuff that is under the influence of gravity and entropy, you mix it with water, you bring it into levity and more form, also known as negentropic force, and that creates life. Or as some people have said, the question isn't why the apple fell from the tree, but it's how the apple got up there in the first place. And we in medicine are not allowed to study that. That sounds like a bold and maybe dramatic statement, but it's absolutely true. We have no clue. We don't have any idea of what a living being is. And my whole thesis was the first point of that is you got to look at water, because without water, there's no life. Water is the medium through which these forces of levity and form, work and actually organize substance into living entities. Unless we get that, the whole situation is hopeless for understanding health and disease.
Well, maybe this is why people in the alternative health and wellness space are pursuing things like, I don't know, Reiki and meditation and mindfulness, because they understand that there's more to these bodies than meets the eye. I guess that's part of what you're saying.
Right. But what they often don't understand is that Reiki or energy healing fundamentally has to work through water. And you could say, I keep beating this drum. The reason is because if you don't, and if you keep it into this, normal oncology places now, they're happy for you to do meditation and Reiki and things like that. The reason is they have their realm, which is so-called science, or as I like to say, the trouble with science is it's not very scientific, meaning they have this theory that we're just stuff. And then they say, okay, if you want to look into energy and all this sort of woo-woo stuff, you can do that over there and maybe it'll help and maybe it won't. It has nothing to do with our domain. And that's the trouble. And I'll tell you, that's what the mission of Rudolf Steiner was, is to start what he called spiritual science, which is the study of science, matter, and how that interacts with spirit or forces. And my point here is that if you look into it, it interacts through water. And so if you do Reiki and you keep it into I'm just into these forces and there's no connection with substance, it becomes not a threat because you're not threatening their worldview. And I would say, therefore, ineffective. You have to understand, we are in a time in humanity's evolution where we either understand this or it's not going to go well, because this is how life works. And we have to have the repercussions of not understanding this is people think they can download their mind onto a computer, because if there's no life, then what's the difference? And that's going to be a real problem.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about today. And I will put a link in the show notes so that people can access your book and some of the authors and resources you've mentioned. And I want to ask you kind of a different take here at the end instead of my usual question. What is one practical takeaway that you might have for someone who has just been diagnosed with cancer?
Read my book. That's a little arrogant thing to say. It will give you an idea of the dilemma that you're facing. And then there are other things. You have to somehow, each of us is called these days to investigate our own hearts and minds and see what is right for us. And I would just invite everybody to do that as in as open-hearted way and as a questioning way as possible, because you may find that the conventional therapy that they're offering you may have an 80% cure rate for your situation, in which case that's probably something you want to do. On the other hand, you may find that the real improvement that you might get is minimal at a very high cost to yourself. And in that situation, I would ask yourself the question, is my worldview more important than my life? If it is, then do it. If it isn't, go somewhere else.
Excellent, Tom. Well, thank you for that advice and for all your time today. We really appreciate you and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Okay, thank you.
Our guest today was Dr. Tom Cowan. Visit his website to find his book and other resources at fourfoldhealing.com. And you can find me at holistichilda.com. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.